Hello? This is part 3 of Thoughts on the book For Good and Evil, The Impact of Taxes in the Course of Civilization by Charles Adams. In this third part, which happens to coincide with his third section, he starts talking about the Middle Ages. We've moved past Rome and are entering the feudal era. Where he says, indirect taxes and tolls multiplied and provided feudal lords with what revenues they needed. These taxes, however, stifled commerce, and the decline of civilization in the West may have been the fault of the tax system as much as overemphasis on the world to come. Byzantium and Kievan Russia became the new centers of civilization. They also emphasized the other world, but their taxes and commerce were light, and money was welcome. Trade, which was almost non-existent in the West, was active and healthy in the East. This explains why the Eastern Roman Empire lasted an extra 1,000 years. When Islam burst forth on the world in the 7th century AD, the promise of reduced taxes on a decadent Roman world may have had greater appeal than the promise of paradise to come. Islam ceased to spread when converts were not offered a tax break. Just a coincidence? In the medieval world, tax customs petrified into fixed sacred demands in the government as well as the taxpayer. Kings desperately needed more wealth, but those who created unheard-of taxation invited rebellion. Kings had to search for new ways to raise revenue outside the local Christian population. They turned on the Jewish community and fleeced it until there was little visible Jewish wealth left. They stole from the church whenever possible. Eventually, when all other avenues were exhausted, the concept of new taxation by consent was discovered as a means around the prohibition against unheard-of taxation. Kings who obtained taxpayers' consent to new taxes had to grant something in return. This bargain for taxes became fundamental to the process of government, and with it our forefathers purchased their liberty with taxes and bequeathed it to us. This is, in short, his view of what taxes did. Taxes after the Roman Empire happened to stifle commerce because it was a bunch of indirect taxation. Any direct taxation that was new was argued against, was used to incite rebellions by the peasants or the lesser nobles. It's important to remember that in the feudal era, the king was in charge, yes, but at least for a large part of the existence of kingdoms such as England, France, Holy Roman Empire, Italy, and so on, the king was first among equals. That is, there were other powerful nobles in the realm who were against new taxes in every way. And you also had the peasants, meanwhile, and a few free trade towns here and there trying to keep their independence desperately. But, they're very rich, so the king likes to tax them. They don't happen to have a lot of soldiers, so the king likes to tax them. So there aren't a whole lot of free ports moving around. You had, after the fall of the Roman Empire, a West which suffered dark ages for 1,000 years. Where learning and movement between civilizations, countries, towns, villages even, was sparse. The vast majority of folk lived and died in the same place where their forefathers had lived and died for as many generations as they could remember. You heard stories about kings and princes marching here and marching there, and occasionally a man of learning who always happened to be a member of the church came through town. And for the most part, it was a very homegrown, village-set existence. And the king or some noble would come through and demand taxes. If it was your noble, right, then what was the agreement you had? And there were agreements that were codified into tradition and law. I give this amount to my superior, and my superior gives this amount to his king, and so on. And this works to an extent, but the more you want the government to do, the more the government decides it wants to do, the more that kings wish to raise armies in order to expand their empire, the more the king wants to build a fancy castle, build a fancy palace, build a strong navy, then this is what taxes are used for: military strength, and occasionally, personal luxuries. It isn't like today where you have a bunch of welfare states helping the people and keeping a close eye on the economy. No. You as the king may not have been able to read or write, may not know any of your numbers, and you're relying on someone else to tell you exactly how much money you get each year. You don't really understand this, but you have an intimate knowledge of your local land, right? About how much you're supposed to get in taxes every year, and what the local weather patterns mean. At least that's the idea. Of course, what happens in reality is that you end up with a lot of absentee landowners spending most of their time in London, for example. Spending most of their time allowing essential, allowing someone who works for them to collect the taxes and so on. Well, the rich nobles spend the taxes and don't really understand what's going on here, because they aren't the people who farm and trade. Trade is beneath a gentleman. I'm not a farmer, I'm a warrior, sort of bit. So you have a very different understanding of the tax system in this sense, a very different understanding of the government. And what holds the government together is not the consent of the governed. It is because I am born a peasant, they are born a king, and there is this sacred agreement between us, watched over by God himself, as it is. There is a tradition that we do these things, we give this percentage of our goods to the Lord, and the Lord does this for us, protects us, or the Lord is responsible for the maintenance of the wall, or the maintenance of the canals, or something like this. And of course, everything is owned by the lords. So the peasants own not much at all. And as the Middle Ages continue on, the peasants own less and less and less. There is a great sense of common ownership in these villages, from what I understand. Common lands where you all graze, that are owned by the village in general. But then this common land is slowly enclosed by the rich landed classes. And we end up, at the end of the Middle Ages, instead of serfs and nobles, you have a sort of workers in factory and rich capitalists. The worker and the owner having the same relation, but now mediated through the effect of wages instead of wheat. And this is a long, long story, but it's sort of the beginning of how we think about the way a government should be run, right? The American Revolution, for example, is about understanding the mistakes of the past and trying to do them better. American Revolution is about being taxed in a new way, not a more cruel way, but a new way, and that's what leads to the rebellion against England. The French Revolution is over being taxed extremely heavily for the 100 Years' War, for the construction of Versailles, for these nobles and so on, who are, to the eyes of anyone with half a brain, totally uninterested in the people. They keep raising armies and going to wars and wars and wars and fighting in battles over land that is taken from them within 100 years. We live in an age of peace. We live in an age where our tax money is used for defense and not for offense. The existence of countries which take land is something of an anachronism for the vast majority of the Western world. It reminds us of World War II. It reminds us of maybe the Korean War, at least in the United States. We look at the wars we've had recently, at least from the American perspective, and it has to do with Vietnam, Afghanistan, the Gulf War, Iraq, the War on Terror, which are the war on drugs, which are mainly about supporting a country or creating a country or deciding who is in charge in a country, although the Iran coup example where I believe where the Shah was put back in charge and so on. It just makes you think, whenever I read about the Middle Ages, how different the world was then. And how easily we could slip back into such a world. Mm-hmm. Okay, so the interesting here. Taxes in the Middle Ages, at least in Europe. So again, this book is a very Eurocentric book. I have based on the information here, I have no idea what the taxes were like in China or Japan or India, in these other civilizations which are centuries and millennia old. The farthest east he gets before the modern era is Islam, to quote unquote Islam. Which dynasty that was, I'm not entirely sure that he's talking about here. It doesn't name it. The Abbasid, the Umayyad dynasty. Before it was split up. Is this Sunni? Is this Shia? How much is this Persia? It's relatively unclear. But he begins talking about Islam, and he says that what Islam did is it expanded, right, as a religious and political movement. And as it expanded into a new area, the people it conquered were offered a choice. You convert to our religion and you don't pay taxes, or you stay your own religion and you pay taxes. But these taxes are going to be lower than the ones you had before. Lower or the same. We're not raising taxes to an extreme level. And so according to him at least, he says, when the Muslims first moved into Persia, the leader of the Arab forces had sent an advance notice to the Persians to become Muslims or choose between death and the poll tax. For most Persians, the poll tax demanded by the Muslims was less burdensome than the established taxes. Only those in power stood to lose because they paid very little tax. And Islam continued to expand and expand and expand until it became large enough that it needed to, instead of focusing on exploratory measures, right? Because one of the bits about going to war is if you go to war, you get what the other person has. You can take over their treasury. You can take over their gold. You now have the booty in soldiers' arms, for example. The king, the infidel king's golden crown or golden armor. You can melt down and make coins of it. The Christian statues, you can melt them down and make silver coins or gold jewelry or something, which you then use as money. Right? You a tax in place, and all of a sudden you get a bounty of their taxes that they have collected and that are in their city for the use of their city and their government. But now it's yours, and all you had to do was storm a castle. Meanwhile, as you attack, your own costs begin to go down because you lose men. until, of course, you get to a point where conquering someone isn't so easy, or you get to a point where raising enough funds to keep basic administration going becomes a bit of an issue. And as you transition from a conquering barbarian horde to a, what's the word here? To a sedentary civilization. And in the sedentary civilization, you now have to govern and control, right? It isn't so easy to whip up a bunch of your friends and a bunch of drunk dudes into a frenzy and say, join my army, and then they wake up the next day after having a great party, and all of a sudden they are drafted in an army, and you start going north and whatnot, and it's easy to keep your army going because everybody's very poor. They used to live there. It's a bunch of nomads. You're used to living on the move. Everybody has their own horse, or at least horses are more plentiful, expected. You're grazing on grasslands and so on. Your food is more likely to be herds, of cattle or sheep or something. Less likely to be grain. You have to grind it and grow somewhere. It was easy to conquer, but then once you settle down and you start enjoying luxuries, you start building schools, you start building palaces, you start having to bring policemen. Because instead of going to a city and taking all the young men of fighting age and drafting them into your army, now they're in the city as paying taxpayers. So, according to him at least, the Islamic empires begin to need a source of tax money. Because again, if you aren't taxing the people of your religion, but you are taxing people of another religion, and people are allowed to convert, then what slowly happens is people will convert from their religion to your religion because they don't have to pay taxes, or they have to pay very, very low taxes. And this happens over the course of generations, of years and decades. And so what happens is you have a empire, a religious empire, whose tax base is shrinking over time. And whose expenditures are going up. Because, for example, instead of paying your soldiers in the goods that you can you get from somebody else, hey, join my army, and we'll run over the battlefield. We will just defeat these weak enemies here, and then you can take their stuff. You can get a new sword, you can get a new piece of armor, kill the person who has it, and now it's yours, right? We're raiding for goods, but now you have to pay them yourself. Because it is much harder to attack. You're running into walled cities now. You're running into campaigns which last years. Not to mention the fact that you now inherit all the old troubles of the old empire. Were there rebels who wanted to become independent? Now they want to become independent from you. Were there bandits somewhere? Well, now those bandits are preying on you. Were there climate disasters? Every 15 years there's a flood. There's a terrible flood of this one river, and now that flooding river is your problem. You got to deal with it. So on and so on. So what you do eventually is you have to broaden your tax base. You either reduce expenditures, you don't do as much, or you broaden your tax base. And you can only, first of all, you can only reduce expenditures so much. Secondly, if you are born a king, born a ruler, born a sultan, and used to living in luxury, I mean, I've seen the sultan's quarters, like I've seen the palace of one of the sultans in Istanbul, and it goes on for quite a large area. right? You have all this flat land. You have special rooms with special names that are covered with tile. You have the whole harem quarters, which you need guards for, and you have to have you have silks and perfumes going into there. You need luxuries. So it can be very difficult to reduce expenditures for the rich, especially how many children do you have? How many alliances do you need to make? Do you like music? Do you like learning? Do you like gold? Do you like high quality clothing, for example? What sultan born wants to wear, undyed cotton, for example? What sultan born wants to dress like a peasant? And you have this is obvious stuff, right? You're born rich and you like the lifestyle you're in, so you have two choices when you have to expend money on something. You reduce your own luxuries, or you reduce what you do. Or the third hidden choice, the choice which comes to those who rule by fire and sword, you can take what you want. You can raise taxes. So eventually, that's what you do. Okay? He says, the mass conversion of native populations to Islam drained off a large percentage of all taxpayers. The Muslim poor tax and tithes, the money you were supposed to give to the church, were not sufficient to maintain the realm. The greed of the sultans and the caliphs demanded that all sources of revenue be exploited to the utmost. So religious tax immunity passed away, and the land tax once again came down on the peasants. Heavy taxation became the order of Islam as the day of a new age of tax gentleness passed into darkness. Okay. Here is an early supply-side account of the cause of the future of Islam in Spain. Someone, I don't know who's quoting here. Jafar ibn Yahya said, the land tax is the tentpole of the realm. How great it becomes by injustice, how mean by impression. The quickest way to ruin a country, the disuse of the cultivated land, the destruction of the subjects, and the cessation of the land tax is by tyranny and extortion. A ruler who burdens his taxpayers until they cannot both cultivate the land is like one who cuts off his own flesh and eats it when he is hungry. He grows stronger in one part and weaker in another, and the pain and weakness he brings on himself are greater than the ache of hunger which he remedies. I heard some of the old men of Spain from the army and others who said that the Muslims were victorious over their enemies and their enemies were weak and inferior as long as the tax-paying peasants were treated kindly. So it was until in his last day, Ibn Abi Amir reintroduced a fixed monthly pay for the army, took the money by force, and sent tax collectors to the land to collect it. They devoured the subjects and misappropriated their money and exhausted them, so that the subjects fled and could not cultivate the land. The revenues brought to the Sultan diminished, the armies became weak, and the enemy grew strong against the lands of the Muslims and seized many of them. The account was written, he says, 1,000 years ago. Okay, so what chapter is this? Chapter 12, 14. I don't know much about Muslim sources of anything really, so that's why I'm looking it up here. Wait, it says chapter 12. Subscript 14. Al-Tartushi and Taxation and its Effects, 9th to the 12th Century. Islam from the Prophet Muhammad, Volume 1, page 134 to 135. I think it's important to look up the sources of things like this, because I can tell this is a very Eurocentric book, and accordingly, when he begins talking about things like Islam, or later in the book he'll talk about modern Asia. I ask questions because I've seen too often books written by someone outside the culture that talk about the culture, and they can have very odd views sometimes. But what he's trying to show here is that eventually the Islamic empires began raising taxes on all of their subjects, and at this point is when the Islamic Empire stopped expanding, because now you have to spend so much money on your taxation. Now you have to look at it. Now it's much easier to sit in your palace and sort of rot away. Now you become so large that the only people you can prey upon are very small villages. You're not going to be invading the Frankish kingdoms or Romania without extreme expenditures of energy. Much easier to sit at home and raise taxes. And this, of course, ends up, in his view, in the view of the author, destroying the government, because you raise taxes and this money is spent unwisely. We don't live it isn't a welfare state, right? At least theoretically, in a welfare state, you take taxes from the people, you give it back to the people, you keep it in circulation. But when you raise taxes on a state which is neither going to war, then what are those monies spent on? Are they spent on the improvement of roads and the raising of walls? Are they spent on education? Are they spent on improving sewer systems? Sometimes they are, of course, but on occasion they'll be spent to raise statues, to keep the people in charge in a comfortable lifestyle, to compete with Cousin M, who happens to have a better horse than you, or a better line of horses, or happens to have this rare jewel, and now you want a rare jewel, so you got to compete with them, and you have needs for money and so on, not for the people of the empire, but for some people of the empire. He says, the first fatal defect in the structure of the Islamic Empire was its tax system. Lack of control over taxation turned the caliph into a spiritual figurehead with little temporal power. Without effective audit control, the local sultan kept most of the tax money for his personal extravagance, and the caliph's 20% was probably less than 5%. In their lust for riches, the caliphs made the fatal step of farming out tax collections through local governors, or the local governors and generals, for a 20% override, which left 80% for the local ruler. The disease of extravagance infected these local tax chiefs as much as the caliph. In time, they developed courts and riches to rival the caliphs. Corruption brought by too much tax wealth was the second fatal defect in the Islamic world. Tax discontent spread through the empires. Greedy sultans demanded more and more taxes from their subjects. This is just the story of Rome. This is just the story of Persia. This is just the story of all sorts of other empires throughout the world. You conquer, then you stop, then you raise taxes, then you focus on extravagance, and then you focus on short-term viewpoints, and some of that money is spent on improving the empire. Most of the money ends up being spent on improving the lives of the rulers of the empire. And eventually, no one really understands what's going on, because there is this pretend mask on everything, that it's being done for the good, or it's being done for religious reasons, or that we are following the old traditions of our ancestors, or so-and-so is blessed by the gods, or so-and-so is wise and just, and look at all the praises we give to him. But without an effective audit, without a free flow of information, without a way to check on who's paying tax and how much tax they're giving and who's getting tax and how that tax is being spent, monies begin to hide. Corruption rises. The entire empire becomes weaker and weaker and weaker until eventually it is easy prey. This is just Rome all over again. And I think what he's sort of pointing out here is, or what I read here is he gives examples. He begins to give examples of, of France, of England, of America, of I'm not sure, one of the Islamic empires he's talking about. These Islamic empires, of Rome. And you sort of see the same story repeat over and over again in different terms, but it's very, very similar. Okay, and then he begins to talk about European taxpayers, medieval taxation, when taxpayers had God on their side. Medieval revenues were not designed to finance large military actions. The history of civilization at this time focuses to a large extent on the struggles of medieval kings for money to fight wars caused by the collision of expanding empires. Kings and rulers also had to deal with God in the matter of church taxation. Churches were exempt, and this included church lands. Monasteries and abbeys spread throughout the countryside, and they often had vast and rich landholdings which could not be taxed. Thus, the rulers in medieval Europe were frustrated by a limited supply of taxpayers, and by the impropriety of instituting new taxes against their subjects. Okay. The feudal system was based on a contract. Initially, little revenue was generated by the feudal contract, which is a three-party arrangement with God as a third party. Tax provisions in feudal contracts were unalterable. The king of Tours, for example, made a covenant that he would not burden the people with new taxes. A count in his kingdom levied a new poll tax without the king's knowledge, and an early chronicle records the king was horrified and feared the wrath of God for having broken his covenant. The king destroyed the new tax roll, refunded all the taxes paid, and repented of his sins. The world of the medieval era is very unlike our own. Our idea of taxation is consent of the governed. We voted for these taxes. But in these old days, it was also a fact that religion was everywhere. And religion, by its very nature, is unalterable in certain ways. It tends to atrophy. It tends to solidify and disallow movement. Is the church exempt from taxation? Then it is exempt from taxation forever. Do the peasants give 10% of their goods or 10% of their crop to the local lord? Then they give 10% forever. Does the local lord have an agreement with the king that he will supply 5 knights with appropriate arms and 30 villagers as spearmen for a 40-day campaign upon being asked, and he'll do this once a year? Well, then that's the rule. And the king is going to say, all right, that's fine. And then the king's son, the next king, is going to say, well, we have a bigger problem, and I'm going to need more people. Or I'm going to need a bigger castle. Or I need to defend my realm against an issue. Or I have decided that I need to claim my ancestral lands in France, and I am raising an army for that purpose. So you begin to fight. Countries begin to fight. And kings start to need more funds, more power, more money. So where do they go? They go to taxes, because it isn't about making sure the realm prospers. It isn't like the kings are gardeners. No, the kings are soldiers who are owed what they are given, and their duties are set in stone as well, right? And meanwhile, the local lord is going to look on the king and say, what are you doing, right? If the king is currying favor with certain political groups in the kingdom, if the king is spending his money improving certain things, if the king is spending his money building a new castle, then the local nobles, being in a power struggle with the king, have reason to ask, why are you doing this? What is happening? Much, much easier to have the king do what he's done the entire time, which is nothing, which is lead the armies and so on. We don't want the king involved in our local affairs in the exact same way that today, if you are a city or a small town, you don't want the state interfering in your affairs. You don't want the federal government coming down to town and telling you what to do and how to do it. You don't want the federal government saying, we need more taxes because of the war in Vietnam. Or we need more taxes because we have to help these people. Or we need more taxes so that we can buy another tank, right? You're going, as the city town, you're going, justify this to me. How do you justify it? And today, the idea is you justify it with consent. Back in the day, it's a little harder. How do you justify that I need 30 more longbowmen when I'm talking to a lord who can't read, a lord who, in a world where there's no newspapers, in a world where the entire civilization is taught by priests from a few small books, in a world where there are constant threats and constant illnesses, constant death. It's very different from ours. What happens eventually is these stresses multiply, and the king says, I need more money, I need more money, I need more money, and he starts looking for more money. So this is why we have according to him, the beginning of the special place of the Jewish people in Europe. And I use special somewhat ironically here, because Jewish people were not of the Christian religion, which means that contracts with them weren't quite overseen with the same religious zealous. The Jewish people had not been peasants living on the land with ancient rights and lords with ancient duties who owned their own armies, who owned their own knights. No, you had the Jewish population in Europe was more likely than not going to be a merchant class, right? You weren't going to be land class. You weren't going to be the peasant class, because you have to be replacing someone, because it's harder to control this new group of people coming in, because because you aren't of the same people, you aren't of the same group, you don't exist in the same way as it is. It's like the stranger coming to town, right? A stranger comes to town and he says, I want to buy a house, I want to live here. Well, the entire town's going to go, who are you? What's going on? Why do you want to live here? Well, and we might look at it and say, so-and-so came to town and he took over the old Gloucester place. He took over the old Jamestown building. He took over the old Smith home. And then his cousin shows up a month later and buys a house. And then his sister shows up and buys a house. And then before you know it, there's like 50 new people in town that weren't there 10 years ago who you don't really know, and they don't go to your church, they don't dress as you do, they don't exactly look the same, they speak a different language, and it can become very difficult to integrate at this point. Now, repeat that ad nauseum. So what's going to happen to the Jewish people is they will be taxed specially. They'll be taxed at higher rates. They will be driven from kingdoms and all their wealth confiscated. They will be the bankers. Like, this happens quite often. All right, you're the king. You need money. What's an option for getting money? Borrowing money. Okay, who do you borrow money from? You can't borrow money from the church. That's illegal. You can't borrow money from the peasants. They don't have any money. You can't borrow money from your local nobles. They don't want to give you any money. And besides, giving them power over you is a bad way to keep your kingdom, to keep your crown. You could go to foreigners. You could borrow money from the King of France, the King of Sweden. But say you're the King of England. What are you borrowing money for? To raise an army, to attack somebody, to defend yourself. So why on earth would another country, would some other kingdom out there loan you money when it will be used to raise an army to fight them? Right? Theoretically, today, if you could raise money from a country that is far away, right? If you are England and you're very unfriendly with France, well, you can go raise money from the Byzantine Empire. You can go raise money from China. Except this is the medieval age. This is the Dark Ages. You can't do that. There's no communication. There's no trust. And even if you did borrow money, it would be in physical gold. You have to put on ships and sail thousands of miles in order to get to you. And those ships could flounder at any time. And now you owe a bunch of money to someplace and you don't have the money they gave you because it sank in a storm. And besides, if you're the Byzantine Empire and England owes you money, how are you going to get that money back if England says, I'm not going to pay you? Right? So you're the King of England. You need some money. You want to borrow some money. What do? Well, the only people you can possibly borrow money from are non-Christian folk who have money. That's going to be the Jewish population. That's it. That is your only option. And if you are a member of the Jewish religion, Jewish people, and you're not going to be a lord, certainly not going to be a lord unless you convert to Christianity and swear to obey the king in the name of God. You aren't going to be a peasant. Nobody wants you. You're very unwelcome. And you probably have to convert to Christianity and swear your oaths to your new knight overlord, not necessarily king, in the name of God. It's a problem. So what options are there for making money? If you can't farm and you can't rule, you have to make something. You have to be a crafts people. You have to be a craftsman, or you can be a banker. Or you can trade money. And it just so happens that you have a lot of relatives and friends and cousins of cousins in other countries. So this gives you access to the monetary system of France and in Austria and Sweden, for example. So now you have the beginnings of cross-border trade in financial products. So you can be a banker. It turns out that if you come into town and you have a bunch of gold and you start saying, I will loan you gold, people are real friendly, real fast. So you have a bunch of Jewish bankers popping up. You have a few Jewish craftsmen as well. And they aren't protected by ancient oaths. They aren't protected by a lord. But they have a lot of money. So say you're the king, what do? You go to the Jewish population, you go to the Jewish bankers, you say, I would like a loan. And the Jewish bankers looking at this and going, okay, the man with all the soldiers wants a loan. Sure, sir, we'll give you a loan. King comes back, I want another loan. Sure, so we'll give you a loan. Eventually, the Jewish banker goes to the court of the king, sits there, takes off his hat. Sir, the payment is due. Do you have it? The king says, I'm sorry, I do not have the payment. Okay, I understand. We can defer, we can restructure the agreement. Yes, that's what the king says. 3 months later, you go back. All right, you have the money now. No, I don't. Do you have the money now? No, I don't. The king comes back to you. I need another loan. What do you mean you need another loan? I need another loan. I need money. You'll get your money back once I conquer France. You'll get your money back once my investment works off. And maybe it does. But maybe it doesn't. And the king is sitting there going, I owe a bunch of money to these Jewish bankers, and I don't have the money. And yet, these Jewish bankers are still loaning out money to people besides me. They obviously have money. And I could just take that money. I mean, there's no overlord to protect them. There's no traditional tax agreement. There's no consent to the governed. They aren't citizens. They aren't even Christians. So that's what the kings do. You raise taxes on the Jews, especially as a people. Special Jewish taxes were reintroduced in AD 813 by Louis the Pious, the son of Charlemagne. It was a modest revenue device at first, but like all taxation without representation, it quickly escalated. One medieval historian summarized the Jewish tax situation with these words: wherever and whenever one casts his eye on the Jewish communities in the Middle Ages, the observer always finds the Jews in the clutches of extortionate tax collectors. When a churchman suggested that the king forced the Jews into the church, the king scoffed at the idea by pointing out that if the Jews became Christians, he would be rid of valuable property and given only a subject in return. As Christians, they would be protected by the Magna Carta and other medieval tax-oriented charters. If the king became impatient and wanted to speed up the collection process, he would imprison the richest Jews and their families in the Bloody Tower. King John, for example, ordered a wealthy Jew, Abraham of Bristol, to pay him 10,000 marks. The mark was 8 ounces of silver. So 8,000 ounces of silver. When the man refused, John ordered that his tax collector extract 1 tooth every day until payment was made. After 7 days and 7 teeth, the assessment was paid. For 60 years, the Jewish community was plundered until the Jews were destitute people. King Edward in 1290 ordered the Jews to leave England partly because they were no longer valuable property. But you take the loan, or you raise taxes on them, raise taxes until they don't have any money, and then you kick them out of the country and take whatever's left. For the next 365 years, Jews were ostensibly forbidden on English soil. In the name of God, angels, and saints, the French king Philip the Fair expelled the Jews from France ostensibly for oppressive money-lending policies. With the Jews gone, to whom would the French borrowers make payment? Like a good sovereign, Philip appointed royal guardians to collect the loans made by the Jews. With the Jews gone, the money quite legally passed to the crown. It says, this scheme did not work well. The Jews were good businessmen who kept their customers happy, whereas the king's debt collectors were ruthless thugs. Finally, in 1315, the Jews were invited back. The Jews returned, but the king's successor did not honor his commitment. In 1322, the Jews were expelled again. The Jews fleeing from England, France, and Central Europe found favor in Spain. For 2.5 centuries, the Jews lived peacefully in Islamic Spain under the Moors. Their welcome turned sour after the Christians took over and expelled the Muslims. In 1492, only a year after they had been granted a lucrative contract to collect taxes for Queen Isabella, expulsion was ordered. The King of Portugal offered his land as sanctuary for a head tax of 1 ducat plus 25% of the wealth of the immigrating Jews. 6 months later, he threw the Jews out of his country and, naturally, kept the taxes. The road to Dachau stretches back 500 years. Hitler's solutions to his Jewish problem were not new. Since the Middle Ages, the Jews in German-speaking Europe had been taxed and exterminated. Long before Hitler, the Jewish poll tax had become the poll tax of shame. It was levied and collected in an abusive and rude manner. The ghetto arose primarily as a convenience to the tax collector. The isolated part of the city set aside for the Jews was a tax district. In order to leave the ghetto, the Jew had to pay a special tax. When German rulers needed large revenues, they did not need to increase taxation. They would issue an expulsion order. And so on and so on. So if you are the Jewish people, if you are a folk who are very heavily taxed, if you are a folk who are often attacked, if you are a folk who deal in monies which are often taken from you, and you often have to move around from place to place to place. You don't settle in a town and think of that town as yours because you know that 50 years ago there were Jews here and now they are dead or they are gone. And then in 100 years from now, all the Jews existing will be dead or gone. And this repeats no matter where you go, no matter what you do. And you happen to be involved in a trade which has to do with money, which in ye old medieval times means gold and silver, little small coins which are easy to hide and transport. So what do? You start smuggling. Do you hear rumblings from the court that they're about to attack the ghetto? Do you know that the king is in financial distress and he's looking for a quick source of gold? What do? You start moving your people slowly out of the place, but people don't like to move. Grandpa, I was born here. They won't do anything terrible to me. I'm a German. I'm a Frenchie. And Grandpa's looking at you like, you poor dumb soul. This ain't gonna turn out well. So it's very difficult to move people because guys, where are you gonna go? You're gonna travel the city, travel the roads, and someone's going to ask, who are you? Where are you going? What's going on? You have to pay poll taxes on these roads. You might be set upon by bandits. You enter a new city and they're going to say, oh, you're Jewish. In order to enter the city, you need to pay a 25% tax on everything you owe. so that you can become a citizen of our city, or so that you can be protected by our country, or Kingdom of Portugal in this example. You start smuggling, right? You start moving gold around. You may not be able to convince little Timmy to move him and his wife out of town, but just in case, let's get some gold coins with your cousin Ed. And he's a banker, he's invested, he knows, right? And you can get it back because you have this large banking system. So that's what you do. And now the king, for all his heavy taxes, goes in and says to the Jewish people, give me money. And the Jewish people say, I don't have any money, search for it. I don't have any money, look for it. If the people of the town run you out of town with nothing but the clothes in your back and a little purse, you better be able to stuff all your wealth into a little purse. You better be able to access your wealth internationally. And you better not tell the ruler about their taxes. I don't owe all that money, he says. And if you're the king, what options do you have? The easy option, the simple option, the oh my God, obvious option to anyone with a whit of sense, right, is, as far as the modern world is concerned, do you have a very small minority that are very rich? You put taxes on them, and then you make sure they stay there and pay the taxes, because it's a really good source of revenue for you. And you don't fleece them too much, because they can move. They can leave. They aren't your peasants. They aren't your lords tied to castles. No, they are a banking class, a merchant class, a craftspeople class who arrived here 50 years ago. And if you kick them out, they're going to just go somewhere else and create revenue for someone else. So, I mean, we look at it, or at least I do, and I go, hey, we got a Jewish quarter of the city. Let's keep them here. Let's keep them happy, because they're making a lot of money for me. And you can still do the bit where you show up with some soldiers and say, I need a loan, right? Yeah, I need a loan. I just need a loan at a very low interest rate, is what we would say today, right? I need a loan. I need an interest-free loan. And it's not a great position to be in, but you get one interest-free loan. All right, you got the soldiers, you got the guns, you have the power of the state. Go ahead. I understand. This isn't great. This isn't fair. This isn't probably all that legal, but okay. And this happens once in a while, and that sucks for the people, but it's not too. It's survivable. It's when you come back and back and back and back, and you try to take everything, right? It's this short-sighted greed which results in tax revenues from the Jewish population dropping like a rock. And this is what can happen for any minority, really. He begins thinking in this part of the book. There is this idea, right, that if you tax the rich people, all the rich people will leave, and yeah, I mean, to a certain extent, that is what happens. If you raise taxes on the rich to a high enough level, then a sizable percentage of rich people will leave. Or, at the very least, a sizable percentage of rich people will move their money out of the country just in case. A sizable percentage of rich people will not tell you about their money, because you keep raising taxes on them. So you have to find this minority, and you can squeeze them, yeah, but squeeze only so hard. If you squeeze too hard, you pop the orange. You'll pop the grape, and all the wealth and usefulness of this group runs through your hands like water, like grape juice, and it spills in the ground. You can't catch any, but you're licking it off your fingers, trying to get some of the nutrients out of the grape. The innumerable schemes devised to steal Jewish wealth were equally matched by schemes in the parts of the Jews to protect their wealth. Okay. So we're using here a historical example where we have lots of information about what happened. It's very clear the method and the means. And we can say, oh, well, we aren't the Jewish population of so-and-so country, right? Like, we aren't a non-citizen. We are citizens. And that affords us greater rights. But some of the lessons still remain. One of them being that you want to be a citizen of the country that taxes you. If you're taxed by a country and you're not a citizen of that country, then you have very little to protect you. And certainly you want a strong law court, right? If you are a foreigner who is living in a different country, or who is being taxed by a different country, you want above all a strong legal system. So higher taxes can be matched by a strong legal system to an extent, because if higher taxes take revenue from a person, a stronger legal system guarantees a protection of that revenue in the other direction. It can't be stolen from you. There must be a law passed, there must be signs made. It can't literally be robbed from you at gunpoint, or if it is, it's returned to you. If the tax collector acts inappropriately, or the IRS takes too much money, then you can sue them to get that money back. So even if taxes are high, as long as the legal system is strong. So we can understand this in the modern sense. If we tax the rich and the wealthy, and they leave, well, first of all, there's only so many places they can go. With the strong legal system, if you end up in North Korea somehow, you aren't keeping that wealth. That's not happening. If you end up in France, probably keeping the wealth. If you end up in, Syria, probably not keeping that wealth. So if you're, but what it illustrates here is the idea again that if you raise taxes, you need to also make those taxes clear. You need to make the rules and laws and effects very clear so people know what they're getting into. There's nothing worse, right, than receiving a notice in the mail. We are levying a special tax that we didn't tell you about, and you all of a sudden owe us a bunch of money. It's one thing to know that heavy taxes are coming. It's another thing to be told. The king's taxmen show up one day with a couple of soldiers behind him and say, there was this, didn't you hear last night in the Bundestag, there was a special tax levied, or 2 days ago that the king posted notices. Or you get a piece, you get something in the mail. If the king does the opposite, returns money to you, says, oh, we're amending the taxes, and that's good, right? Yes. But it's like anything else. We are more worried about the negative results than the positive results. We remember bad things more clearly than we do good things, because it's biological, right? That's how you survive. All these good things may happen, but the one bad thing is probably the jaguar that's going to kill you. Okay, so medieval England. He's When the king, he talks about England now, when the king asked the council, it was a council of barons, essentially, the other rich nobles in the area. The king asked the council for a scutage from the lesser knights of the realm for a war in Flanders. The barons refused. At the same time, the Pope gave the crown some lands in Sicily. The king again asked for an aid to secure these lands. The council again refused. When the king asked for an aid to recover lands in Normandy, the barons asked, was not Normandy the same as Sicily and Flanders? The king was learning that a great politician had to be a good debater. He answered the great council with the domino theory. If Normandy is not secure, French kings could easily invade England. The recovery of the king's estates in Normandy was actually a defense of the common realm because these lands protected England from invasion. Like good politicians, the barons compromised and began approving limited aid for the king's military operations in northern France. The concept that taxes for military purposes must be for defense developed at this time in England. It will reappear again in the Netherlands, Imperial Spain, and the U.S. Constitution. The constitutional doctrine that developed was expressed by Henry of Ghent, a Parisian legalist whose writing on legal theory appeared from 1272 to 1296. The king could not levy extraordinary taxes except upon evident utility, evident necessity, and dire emergency. The lawfulness of a tax was determined by its expenditure. We no longer subscribe to that view, he says. But basically, as we enter into England, we go back to the king is raising monies for military purposes, for our purposes of an army. And it is either offensive or defensive. If it's offensive, then you're going to go with a good defense is a great offense. Spiel. Right? Because you're asking a bunch of your barons to contribute money so that you can go on a wild adventure. Barons aren't going to like that. That just makes the king stronger. But if you're asked the barons to contribute money so that you can protect them, protect the realm, the barons are all for it, to a certain extent at least. And hence you end up with the 100-Year War. So this is the interesting thing about England, that you had a strong king in England, but more important, you had strong nobles. The king of England was less a king, less a ruler than happened in France. In France, for example, the king eventually became essentially all-powerful. Eventually, there were no nobles who were able to challenge the king in any particular way in France. In England, the opposite was the same. So what we see is that a certain amount of distributed power means that agreement has to be made for a tax. Whereas if political power and military power is extremely concentrated, then he who has the power decides the tax. And one must always ask, if taxes are used, if we raise taxes for defense, when is this correct? When are we actually being attacked? Because the problem, of course, is who has the most information about the dangers to the country? The government. The person in charge, the king or the president. And so if the president or the king comes to us and says, I need money in order to protect this country, and this is the danger, then who are we to question? How do we know all that they know? The military secrets. For example, they've been involved in politics for years. They can tell whether our armed forces are actually strong or if it's just a paper tiger, for example. You're going to rely upon the person who has the most knowledge. And the government or the king, in this case, is going to push their idea. He's going to say, yes, it's very dangerous. I can't tell you why, but it's very dangerous. Or we have information that the enemy is this powerful, and in order to defeat them, we must be this powerful in return. And I can't tell you why we think the enemy is that powerful. I can't tell you why we think we need to be this powerful in return. We've had some war games. which are partially secret. We have estimates of the foreign strength. We have readiness reports, which, I mean, we can't tell you our own readiness reports. We can't tell you how effective our guns and missiles are against the enemy, or how effective they think they're going to be, because that would tell the enemy, and so the enemy would know our strength, and that's dangerous. And so I'm talking about defense here, but the same is true for almost any taxation, for any use. The person in power is going to say, I need this. The Sultan is going to say, I need, fancy silks from the East in order to exhibit my royal stature, in order to make my wives happy, in order to give these silks away as gifts, in order to uphold my station. And how many peasants in the Abbasid Empire had any idea what the sultans or the kings were actually up to? Had any idea how threatened the nation was? In England and in France, you have a poor peasant, or you have a local baron. How much do you know? Like, the only way to know is to have as much power as the king, as much knowledge as the king, to be a great noble. So the only people who can challenge the government or the king are those who have great power themselves. Today, we live in a slightly different world. We don't have quite kings and great nobles. And that is important, I think, to understand. Like, why is it this happened? It's because of agreements like this that we're talking about here. The king asked for an aid to recover land. The king has to go to his barons, go to his people and say, I need money. And the people in return can say one of three things. They can say no, they can say yes, or they can say yes with caveats. Right? They can say, no, you do not need this money for whatever it is. You do not need this money for a war in Flanders. You do not need this money for a social program. You do not need this money to do a study about the efficacy of sucking frogs on colds or something. They can say yes. Yeah, you know what? King, government, president, whoever you are, I think you're right. You need this money to protect us from the illegals. You need this money to defend the realm. You need this money to make the capital be the wonder of the world, for example. Or you can say with caveats, right? Yes, you can invade Flanders, but in return, sign this document that says you will lower taxes 2%. Yes, you can invade. Here's some money, but in return, sign taxes that say no. Sign a piece of paper that says no one can be imprisoned without consent. Yeah, we'll give you some money, but in return, you need to report back to us about that money. You need to be very open about what's going on here. You can. Here's some money, but in return, we need you to pass or sign off on this law, for example. Or it's an argument about the budget, and we'll give you this money as long as you give us this money for this reason and that reason. And all of a sudden compromise. And it is because you have people willing to compromise that a government can function without a unitary executive, without unitary power. Legislative, judicial, and executive power in one person or in one order. Compromise is the basis of a workable government. Compromise is the basis of an economic system where you have multiple people with power as a basis of a political system with multiple people with power. So what this says to me is that if you see a political system or economic system where there is not compromise being made, then that is a very dangerous sign. On the one hand, it's a sign of, incompetency, of stalemate. It's the sign of failure. It's the literal sign of a country which is unable to govern itself, which doesn't know its own identity, doesn't know its own purpose. It is also the sign that somebody is trying to break this stalemate by gaining unitary power. Because if you have a bunch of people together in a room and they are trying to get something done and they can't compromise on what's happening, then you have an ideological problem, right? I think A, I think B, and we just can't agree. You have an educational problem, right? I think A, I think B. I can prove B is wrong. I don't believe you. Or you have a stalling problem. I think I want A. I want B. Okay, I'll give you A and a little bit of B. No, I want all of B. I'll give you A and some of B. No, I want all of B. I'll give you a little bit of A and a lot of B. No, I want all of B. Right? And that is someone trying to say, I will not compromise. You are not right. You do not understand. And this is how a system breaks down. And we can see this in taxes, for example, in the argument over taxes, because of England, where you get this idea that if you're going to take money from people, you have to agree. And why does the king have to have the barons agree to give him money? Because the king does not have enough power to take the money from the barons. In France, eventually, he does. Which leads directly to the French Revolution and is a great reason why the English avoided exactly that revolution. Okay. So now he begins to talk about Russia, Switzerland, Spain, and Germany. This is interesting here, right? Russian history has fascinated and puzzled Westerners for centuries. The Russian political psyche developed out of the tax brutality of the Golden Horde and the early Moscow rulers. Later, Peter the Great put Russia on a course to superpower status by reorganizing a tax system that had crippled economic growth for centuries. He gave the Russian people the option either to pay poll taxes or to enter state service. The communists, after destroying the ruling class, simply took away the first option. Right. Russia's road to nationhood had little in common with the rise of the nation-states of Western Europe. When the West was enjoying a rebirth of the Greek and Roman culture in the Renaissance, the Russians were under the yoke of the most ruthless tax collector since Sargon and the terror kings of Assyria. Genghis Khan and his Golden Horde swept through the heartlands of the Slavs and annihilated an advanced form of democratic and civilized culture. The Mongol Khans brought a form of oppression to the Russian people that has lingered to the present. Moscow rose to dominance because her princes became the Khan's best tax collectors. Then it was an easy step for the Prince of Moscow to move from chief tax collector for the Khan to chief of everything over everybody. Right? This is why Moscow is the capital of Russia, because the princes of Moscow, I thought it was a duchy, the princes of Moscow were chief tax collectors for the Golden Horde, the Mongols. The Mongols swept through Asia, but they also swept through the Middle East, and they swept through Russia. They stopped in Russia and ruled Russia for a very long time. And the Mongols ran an old school empire. They showed up with a bunch of military troops and said, "Give us money or die." Straight up. Give us money or die. Submit or die. Submit or we will burn down your city, burn every one of your documents, and build a skull tower, a skull pyramid with the bones of your people. And they literally did this several times. It's horrid. And so if you are a conquering nation and you end up conquering a people, one of two things happens. You're going to collect taxes, right? So either you settle down and you become the people. You settle down and you enter into the old agreement. You're the new kings. You're the new lords. You build castles. You have farms, for example. You have cities. Or you just show up one day at the biggest city and say, give us money or we're going to burn the house down. And by the way, this guy here is in charge and he better have our money when we come back. And here's a few soldiers to make sure that, here's a few soldiers to protect our chief tax collector. So you have your own tax guy come in. And eventually, it's just easier for you to get a local guy to do the tax collecting for you. You know what? This guy's, he's trusted by us. His family served us for generations. You know, he knows the local area. He has ancient ties to the peasants and whatnot. And our tax collectors keep getting killed or stoned or lost. But you know, this guy works for us. He's a nice worker. And we're going to give him more power and more power because he keeps giving us money. And eventually you show up and you say, oh, we need money. And what if the guy says, oh, here's your money, and I found some extra. Ooh, that's great, right? I want this guy to be my tax collector. He has extra money. I don't know where he gets it. I don't know how he does it, but he has extra money. So that's what happens. Tax collector, tax collector, tax collector. Eventually, as I understand it, you basically have, like, once a year, the Mongols send some guy to send a small troop to collect money, to collect the gold, to collect the tribute, and just drag it away with them. And they do this, and they do this, and they do this. And the tax collector is giving money to the Khans, but because he's in charge of collecting the taxes, because he's directly in relation to the taxes, he says to the Khans, oh, here's your money, and he gives them 90% of what he found. 10% he keeps for himself. Then 11%. Then 12. Then 15. Then 20. And he squeezes the people, ends up building himself a castle, building himself a Kremlin sort of thingamajig with walls and towers. It's a fortress. And one day the Khans send their little troop to collect monies, and the little troop doesn't come back. They send a slightly bigger troop, doesn't come back. Okay, we're going to go see what's going on. They send an army. Army runs into the walls of this city they didn't even know was being built. And the Prince of Moscow, you know, stands up on the walls of the city, and with a megaphone or something, right? Or sends a letter, more likely, and says, "We are the Russian people. We will not be paying any more money to the Khans, and if you want some money, come and get it." And then the Khans say, "All right, we'll come and get it." And the Khans try and come and get it, and they can't get it. Then what happens? The ruler of Russia says, all right, I'm in charge now. The Khans are gone. They aren't coming back. I'm the tax collector. I know how to get taxes. I have I have the walls. I have the soldiers. I'm the one who should lead you. There's no one else. You don't see anyone else around here. Now you're in charge. And now you have the Tsar. The Tsar of Russia. This is how it happened. The Mongols were interested only in taxes and recruits for their armies. They showed no interest in Russian culture or any culture for that matter. Now, during the 200 or more years of Mongol rule, there were three distinct phases of their tax system. In the beginning, the Mongols farmed out tax collection to powerful Muslim merchants from Baghdad. Okay. Then this worked to an extent, but your tax collectors kept getting killed. The Muslim tax farmers were slavers as much as tax collectors. In 1262, a number of Russian cities revolted and slaughtered the tax collectors to the last man. The great Russian prince Alexander Nevsky persuaded the Khan to take no reprisals, but rather reform his tax system. The Khan divided Russia into a number of military financial districts, governed by a tax director called the Great Baskak, supported by a garrison of Mongol warriors. A census was taken. Local Russian princes took charge of everything except tax collection and military affairs, which were under the Khan. The third and final state of Mongol taxation carried seeds of destruction. The Khan made the common but fatal mistake of relinquishing control over tax collection. The great Baskaks were replaced with Russian princes. An obscure prince of an unheard-of Russian town caught the Khan's attention with his unusually successful tax-collecting methods. The town was Moscow, and the prince was Ivan I, nicknamed Moneybags, for his extraordinary talents as a tax collector. The Mongols probably asked, why not let angry Russian taxpayers deal with Ivan? Ivan took full advantage of his new rule in the Khan's tax system. Without the Baskaks to keep a watchful eye on the revenues, the prince had an opportunity to keep much of the tax money for himself. With huge profits from surplus revenues and shrewd bargaining with the Muscovy Doroga, the Prince of Moscow started to acquire adjacent principalities and lands. His revenues enabled him to build the Kremlin, which was the only fortress in Russia capable of withstanding a Tatar siege. It wasn't until the 16th century the Mongol grip on Russia was finally released by the efforts of Ivan IV, called Ivan the Terrible. The power base established by his fathers through taxation had built up to the point where he could expel the Mongols once and for all. He initiated this expulsion by first repudiating all tax obligations to the Tsar when the Muscovy Doroga made his annual visit to receive tribute. And so Ivan is in charge. What does he do now? It says, Ivan the Terrible established a special branch of agents with extraordinary power apart from the regular government. Hence the name Oprichnina, meaning special, separate, or apart. These special agents had their own courts and operated in their world of their own. Ivan's special agents took a loyalty oath to the Tsar. They would associate only with fellow Oprishniki. So on. So he had special tax collectors. The Oprishnina confiscated land from the nobles and transferred them to new owners of themselves with new revenue and serves obligations to the Tsar. So Ivan is in charge, and he says, the taxes now to rule the country. He starts raising taxes. The road to serfdom in both Russia and Rome was similar. In both places, overtaxed peasants accepted bondage to large landowners as a way to avoid the tax collector. The bondage of serfdom was less oppressive than the tax burdens of freedom. In Russia, serfdom came slowly. There was no Diocletian who revolutionized the tax system one year and put everyone into serfdom the next. In the beginning, peasants became de facto serfs when they became tenants of farmlands. The landlord gave them land, a house, livestock, and farming tools. A mortgage was executed by the peasant, which was due and payable each November. After paying a 1/3 crop rent, interest on the mortgage, and taxes to the Tsar, nothing was left to pay off the mortgage. In the normal course of events, the debt could never be paid off, which is the way the system was intended to operate. Landlords developed an interest in avoiding tax. So what you have here is exactly the same thing happening to Russia that happened to Rome. the Republic in Rome turned into an empire. The empire slowly became controlled by a few rich landowners, and you ended up with a world of peasants and rulers, which eventually turns into the feudal system of peasants and kings. In Russia, this turned into the great nobles and the serfs. So Rome fell because it became extra weak and couldn't collect taxes. In Russia, on the other hand, they focused on collecting taxes. You know, Peter the Great here now tackled the problem like Diocletian. Everyone would be a worker or a taxpayer. The unemployed had 4 choices: pay the poll tax, become a serf and live tax-free, enter government service, military or civil, or be a galley slave. Most of the drifters had a choice between being a galley slave or a serf. Serfdom was obviously the better choice. To the government, serfs were not tax-free because the serf's lord had to pay a poll tax on all serfs held. So instead of the rich nobles of the rich senators being exempt from taxation, they had to pay a tax for each of the serfs they had. What's going on here? What is happening is that in the Roman Empire, the Emperor of Rome eventually loses control. Yeah, the Emperor of Rome eventually loses political control. The Emperor of Rome eventually loses economic control. The Emperor of Rome just does not have a strong enough grip. And part of the reason this happens is because the Emperors of Rome changed a lot. It was sort of rule by the sword. You had a lot of internal dissension in the Roman Empire before it fell apart. The Roman Empire tore itself apart by fighting over power. The Russian Empire, on the other hand, you had these Russian czars who managed to keep their power, who managed to maintain their strength. And they did this by, as far as I can, pure political will. The Russians, the Russian Empire crushed the freedom and the livelihood out of its people. The Russian Empire, you didn't. So one of the main differences, right, between serfs and peasants is that peasants have certain rights. Serfs are just property. Serfs are just slaves in another way. A peasant at least has, there are agreements we have with the leader, right? The leader is supposed to protect me. But if you're a serf, the leader doesn't protect you. The leader owns you, right? Because the leader owns the land, and you as a serf are tied to the land. There's no way out. There is no way out of serfdom. A peasant theoretically can travel to a town, can travel to London, can abandon his homeland and work as a merchant or work as a craftsperson, or work as a soldier and get wealth that way. A serf cannot. At least that's my understanding of it. And this, of course, incites a lot of stress, a lot of rebellion. So you have peasants' revolts in the West, but in Russia, you do have serf revolts. And how do you put those down, right? And in peasant revolts in Western Europe, you kill the peasants, you disperse them, they go back to their homes. Serf revolts are a little more complicated because a peasant in England, for example, wants the king to agree to lower taxes. You aren't trying to overthrow the king. You're still loyal to the king. It's just that the king is doing something wrong and you want to correct them. If you're a serf, you want to and you rise up in rebellion, you're trying to destroy the entire system, as far as I understand it, right? You're saying, I don't want to be tied to the land. Or I was listening to a lecture on Russian history last year, and it was saying that there was this view among the Russian serfs that the Tsar was their protector. That the local nobles were very oppressive and terrible, but the Tsar was supposed to be very kind and like a godlike figure. There was a lot of reverence for the Tsar, is what I was told, at least. But nonetheless, the Russian system of making sure everybody paid their taxes, making sure that no one rose to overthrow the government, was very harsh. And partially, another reason why this worked is, so in Rome, you could leave your lands and go join the barbarians, because the barbarians weren't so far away. In Russia, you could leave your lands and go join the Cossacks, who were sort of the Mongols of the central the central steppe. And this there was a huge problem for this. It was seen originally as a benefit, because you would have all the serfs who didn't want to be serfs, all the troublemakers would just leave. So that's good. But of course, what happens is the troublemakers start to leave more. There's more and more and more and more. And the troublemakers end up congregating among the Cossacks. And all of a sudden, the trickle of losing serfs and resources becomes a flood. All of a sudden, you start the barbarians at your gates are strong enough that they start raiding you. And Rome, in this exact same situation, fell apart. Russia, in this exact same situation, invaded the Cossacks. Like they said, we aren't going to wait for the barbarians to come to the gates. We're going to attack the barbarians right now. And this is part of the reason why Russia is so large. It's geography, in that you have very large flatlands, a lot of grasslands, which were populated by differing tribes, nomadic tribes. And so when the Russians start when Moscow starts expanding to become Russia, there's nothing to stop it for a very long time. There's no organized power until it hits, China in the east. What is it? What's that? The Islamic Empire in the middle. I should know this. The one that controls Istanbul. What was it? It was called the Sick Man of Europe. The Ottoman Empire, yeah. China in the east, the Ottoman Empire in the south, and Russia, well, kind of Germany in the west. Poland slowed them for a little bit, not very long. But essentially Germany in the west. But to return to the tax system, how did Russia keep itself together when the Roman Empire, in the same situation, fell apart? Well, first of all, Russia made sure. Well, the emperors of Russia were better emperors than the late Roman emperors. The emperors of Russia were able to keep their power by being very oppressive, by pushing military force, by keeping a close eye on their nobles. And a close eye means a very strong tax system. So you tax people very heavily in order to keep a large military force, so that's why Russia is militarized in a way that we in the United States of America don't quite understand. It's why Russia has this oppressive feeling. It's why Russia has all these very sad writers about how horrible and tough life is. Because in America, we are similar in the sense that we spread westward into open lands by killing a bunch of people along the way. We're a very militarized society. But we agreed to our taxes. Russia that never happened. You were forced to pay taxes. Right. So we talk about the serfs here. During planting and harvest time, some masters required them to work from dawn to dark 7 days a week. No time was left for their own farm. This oppression incited rebellions and strikes. Peasants who refused to work were beaten, put in irons, or compelled to wear a spiked collar. Others were dunked in a river head down until they almost drowned. The Bartschina serfs also achieved a level of communal collectivization in the way they farmed the land for their master. In short, serfdom, the ultimate means of tax control, formed the groundwork for Soviet collectivization of agriculture. And I think this is important to understand here, because it's something we don't really talk about ever. The influence of Russian culture and civilization has been much more significant than we realize. At the end of the Middle Ages, the Russians protected Europe's rebirth in the Renaissance by absorbing the Mongol invaders at the cost of great destruction to themselves and loss of an advanced form of democratic life. The Russians put an end to the growth of Napoleon and his dream of becoming Europe's emperor. Mankind was saved by the Nazi plague by the sacrifice of millions of Russian citizens. Russia's existence has been that of a state under threat, that of a state which very heavily oppresses its own people because internal rebellions are of danger, that of a state which like has the invasion of the Mongols burned into their psyche, I would say. The feeling that out of the great steppes will come a barbarian horde which will burn the cities to the ground and destroy a way of life and take over all that they are, right? Russia is not like China or the United States or England or Germany even, where there are more or less clear geographic boundaries. You can say, if you're trying to, there's mountains to the south, there's sea to the east, there's the Gobi Desert to the west. What do we have to watch out for? The north. If you are England, you need a navy, you're good. If you are Germany, then you keep the Rhine flowing freely. You make sure that Poland isn't too strong. You have these troubles with France. But there's a Black Forest. There's a reason that you have Gaul in Germany, for example. If you're Italy, then mountains to the north, and we have a continuous spot of land. If you're Greece, there's mountains to the north, and as long as we keep the sea lanes open. If you're Mexico, then there's desert to the north, and then this thinning isthmus down south. But if you're Russia, where are your obvious boundaries? This spot of open land, this spot, that spot, the other spot, right? There's no clear delineation of Russia's space until Russia has continued to expand, and a state like Russia, which expands continually for 400 years. What is expansion? It is military adventure, right? So how do you keep your military going? Either you have a strong military because you take monies from those you conquer, or you have a strong military because you have very high taxes. What do you do with a strong military? If you're Rome, the strong military eventually eats you alive. So you better use that strong military, because the strong military can be very useful for putting a new ruler on the throne, giving yourself a new emperor. But if you keep using those armies, if they're always fighting somewhere, then they aren't a problem for you. So you have a very militant Russian existence. You have a very heavy taxation base, which leads to Russia being the belligerent nation in this day. And I think in America, particularly, we look at some place like Russia and we ask, how does this keep going? What are the Russian people doing? Like, why are they being sent to this war in Ukraine, and why are they suffering under the oligarchs, and why aren't they rebelling and fighting against this? Part of the reason is that is the culture that has existed there for well over half a millennium. You can still see this effect happening. Our national psyches are very complex things which survive for much longer than we think. That's what I would say. And the method of tax collection, the reasons and the ideas for what taxes are used for is interesting, because it tells us how a country is organized. What taxes are used for tells us what a country is worried about, or what actions it needs to take. We can compare two countries in similar situations, Rome and the Roman Empire and Russia, and we can say, why did they turn out differently? And taxes are one way to look at this, and I think it can be a very useful way to look at things, because it isn't just about differences in culture, differences in national story, differences in history, differences in geography. It is something which is comparable. Because Russia, if Rome had acted like Russia, then no barbarian would ever cross the Alps. Then Rome would be very sure to keep a large, strong military force so that barbarians could not enter Italy. And Rome would have, instead of these senators who were tax exempt, heavily taxed those senators. The Roman emperor would have kept his legions on the border, would have invaded the east, would have certainly defeated the Germans, would have done the stuff instead of sitting in a peace. And that is really what sort of brought down the Roman Empire, right? The Pax Romana. The feeling that they didn't need to defend themselves anymore, until, of course, the day came when they did. And Russia, at least, has never entered a point in its entire existence where it's gone, you know what, we don't need to fight anybody. We're at peace. We aren't threatened in any way. Russia's always looked at its borders and gone, anyone could invade us again. We are not safe here in Moscow. But of course, we then have to ask, okay, is the military adventure, is the war offensive or defensive? Or the sort of defense where a good defense is a good offense. It's a great offense. And that tells us something about the country as well. I was talking about England earlier, and part of the difference between someplace like England and Russia is England, the king had to ask his nobles for monies. Russia, the king did not have to, the emperor did not have to do this because he had a very strong military force by himself. It has to do with the feudal system here. Do you allow other powers to exist in your country? Do you allow other people to be able to debate with you? Do you allow for taxes to flow through other hands before it gets to you? Because this, I think, is something that the rulers of Moscow, at least, the emperors of Imperial Russia, very much understood that if you allow someone else to give the tax to you, and you don't have a direct eye on which tax is owed, you don't know what's going on in your country, then someone can very easily overthrow you in the exact same way the Ivans overthrew the Mongols. When your family came to power in a certain way, you're going to keep a special eye out for other people coming to power in that exact way. You may not understand the dangers of the Communist Revolution, for example, but at least it wasn't a tax problem in that you didn't know what was going on. You didn't know what monies were owed you. It was a cultural issue. It was a matter of too much taxation. It wasn't a matter of the Russian empires having no idea what was happening. It was a matter of they didn't think it was possible the serfs could rise up in this way. At least as far as I understand it. There was a small nobility in Imperial Russia, which on occasion evidenced a certain intellectual freedom. But as far as I know, it was often stamped out. Reasons are complex, of course. And there were a few Russian emperors who made, I want to say, compromises with some of their nobles. I think, what was it? I want to say like Catherine the Great maybe was one of them. There was a female ruler of Russia who was very conciliatory, or maybe she was like a Polish princess married into the Russian family. I don't remember all the history, but I'm giving a very basic overview of the Russian history from the American perspective. So there's certain things I'm definitely getting wrong, but I think it's still instructive. Because, in my head, Russia and the United States, historically speaking, have much in common, but they turned out very differently. And a large part of that is the way we dealt with internal dissent. There's a reason that you have a communist movement in China that turns out very, very differently than the communist movement in Russia. And it is these cultural, historical differences, these geographical differences, as well as these differences in tax, in organization of the people, in the stories of the entire nation, right? The story of China, at least in my head, is governments get overthrown by barbarians or natural disasters or, internal palace problems. In Russia, the story is countries get overthrown by tax evasion and barbarian invasion, right? So these complexities end up having different strong effects. Right, you're gonna have separate views of what causes problems and what the dangers are for your nation and your people. Like, what are the issues you got to worry about? Who are you worried about? In which way will people act, and so on. And tax, because it's a method of money collection, allows us to compare between different countries and different time periods. It's the organization. Okay. And he talks about the Swiss here. The Swiss are an early democracy, republic sort of thing. You have okay, so basically the Switzerland is a bunch of valleys high up in the mountains. They're called cantons. And the differing cantons sort of came together as one and agreed they would not pay taxes to foreign governments. Italy, France, Germany at various times either rule Switzerland, parts of Switzerland, or attempt to take control of Switzerland. In 1240, the communities of Schwyz and Uri were released from taxation by the Holy Roman Emperor. Austria sent tax gatherers. The Swiss were not willing to submit to full Habsburg taxation. Rebellion followed. During the struggle, the legend of William Tell was born. I have a grandma from Switzerland, and I asked her once, like, what were the Swiss legends? She told me about William Tell, and she was like, yep, that's sort of it. Which, in the one sense, is like, Grandma, seriously, there must be more to Swiss legends than this. And another sense is like, that's a pretty nice history. Like, we don't have a bunch of stories about war and death and pain and struggle. It's like, oh yeah, William Tell, there was some trouble here. We fired a crossbow, and we've been ruling ourselves ever since in more or less peace. It's quite nice. Hi, Ebony. That's my cat. Okay, in 1848, the Swiss adopted a constitution that established a confederation of Swiss cantons with very limited federal government. What is unique is the absence of a large federal bureaucracy. The cantons administer most federal laws. Yeah, so Switzerland is run by a sort of a council instead of a president. Okay. In Switzerland, the final decision on revenue is made by the voters. Unlike the Canadian or U.S. legislators, Swiss legislators cannot vote themselves a salary increase. Salary increases must be submitted to the Swiss people. If increases are to be made in the tax rates, the voters have to approve. In 1975, the Swiss government submitted a referendum to the voters for increasing the income tax rates. The voters turned it down cold. In 1991, Swiss voters were asked to approve a value-added tax. It was also turned down cold. By comparison, the Canadian government recently forced such a tax on the Canadian people despite strong popular disapproval. It says, the Swiss practice of submitting all revenue matters to a vote of the people embodies the wisdom of separating the power to tax from the power to spend. Once these two powers reside in a single governmental agency, the power to spend will invariably override restraints against tax. And here, we get to something very important. Something that the American Constitution tries to do by giving Congress power to raise taxes and the government the one who clears out the laws, but somewhat inefficiently, because the Congress can say the president has to spend these monies in certain ways. But there we go. The idea being that if you are a single entity and you control the power to tax and the power to spend, then you control how much money you need, right? And if you and you also control how much money you get. So if I control how much money I need and how much money I get, then I can have as much money as I want, right? I can raise taxes and I can spend that money. I can spend money I don't have and then say, oh my gosh, we're broke, we need to raise taxes. I can raise taxes and say, look, we have the surplus, we better spend it on something instead of giving it back to the people, right? And the same thing acts in any organization which collects money. An organization which collects money and then spends that money has a very strong incentive to collect more money and spend more money. Collect more money and spend more money, right? You want to do as much as you can. You want to do as much as possible. This is particularly why I think something like a police department receiving funds from the tickets it gives is an extremely terrible idea, right? Because if I'm a police department and I give tickets out, if I'm a city and I give tickets out, and then the tickets I give out are funds that go to me, and I can spend that money however I want, then you have the power to tax and the power to spend in one entity. Which means, I mean, how often does an organization go, you know what, we need to get smaller. You know what, we're going to spend less money this year. I know we have extra money, but we're not going to spend it. We're not going to use it. You know, maybe you put it away for a rainy day. That's about it. Unless you're forced to give the money back, you don't give the money back. And if you are also the person who gets money from that activity, then you're going to keep doing that activity. So a police force, by receiving funds for its own use based on the number of tickets it gives out, what do you think the police force is going to focus on? Revenue gathering activities. Giving out a lot of tickets. Do I need money? Well, I better... the city does this, right? Does the city need money? Well, it's going to step up code enforcement. It's going to send people around to look at gates, to look at houses and say, well, that's overgrown, you need to trim it, and here's a fine. Or you know, this needs repair. Here's a fine. We're gonna send out more parking maids. We're gonna put in some parking meters here. We're gonna put a stop sign here, and there's just gonna happen to be a policeman near it quite often to catch people. We're gonna suddenly change the speed limits from 25 to 15 just along this 2-mile stretch of road, and it's gonna go back to 25. We're going to put a stop sign at the very bottom of a hill, or at just the point in the hill where you don't quite see it as you're coming over, and you got to stop all of a sudden. Well, these sorts of things. A government can do this as well. Well, we need some money. Better pass a law to make something illegal. Maybe pass a law to raise a tax. And if you are the people who are suffering that tax, you're the people who are suffering the code enforcement, you're the people who are getting the tickets, if you don't have the power to control those costs, then the costs will slowly grow out of control. The costs will slowly become bigger and bigger and bigger. You need to be able to stop that. You need to be able to say, you know, that, like, you know, the laws that govern us are decided by us. Because if they aren't decided by us, they're decided by somebody else. And if that person isn't us, they have a very vested interest in making us suffer and life better for them. Right? If you see, if tax laws are being passed that benefit a certain group, then you really, really have to ask what's happening here. And conversely, if laws are being passed which punish a certain group or which make a certain, let's say, revenue gathering activity more desirable for a group, then you really have to ask, is that the best method? Is there a better way? Like for me, at the very least, a police organization, if it collects fines, the money collected needs to go to like the central government, right? It needs to go to the state government. It needs to go to the city's general fund or something, right? Not directly back to them. This is part of the problem with like civil asset forfeiture in the United States. The police stop somebody with $10,000 in his car, and it may be drug money, or he may be using it to go buy a boat. And the police stop somebody, there's $10,000 in his car. They say, we think this is drug money. They take it. Then they give that drug money to the federal government, and the federal government says, okay, well, you gave us $10,000, so we're going to split this with you. And the city, the police department gets $4,000. The federal government gets $6,000. And this is all legal because it's probably drug money, but we can't really prove it. And you get into a court battle, and who owns the money, who controls the money? I mean, look, at the very least, you collect monies for something. You don't get, if you're an individual collecting monies for something, I understand why there's maybe a reward system, to turn it for whistleblowers to say something, for example, so that you can sue an employer who breaks the law, so that you can have an incentive to make individuals come forward in order to reveal something nefarious. Because if I report on my boss doing something illegal, I'm probably going to get fired. So yeah, you might want to have a whistleblower protections or reward for doing this. If you have, for example, a bug bounty program on on computer vulnerabilities, then you can have an incentive. Oh, the person who finds this bug and reports it to us gets a reward because of that, because you're incentivizing individuals. But when you start to incentivize a group, then you expand the possible power level of that activity. You expand the possible corruption issues inherent in that activity. And this isn't to say, that every police organization that ever engages in civil asset forfeiture is doing bad, or even that most of them are. It's just that some of them 100% will be, because the opportunity is there. And the same exists in any government. If you don't keep a close eye on the government, it's going to raise taxes and raise taxes and raise taxes on those people who do not have political power. So your taxes being raised, that indicates one of two things. Either the government has a good point and convinces people when it says we need to do this thing, or the government is fooling you completely and grabbing monies so that it can use the monies without any regard for whether it actually needs that money or not. And so how do you determine whether it's scenario A or scenario B when taxes are raised, when a bond is passed for a school building, when some sort of fine is levied for speeding or lying to a court, activity, whatever it may be? Well, you have to have information at your disposal. How often is this used? Who decides what the level of the fine is? Where's the money going from this fine? Is there an investigation into corruption in about organizations like these? Are the organizations telling us what's actually going on, or are they hiding? Are they saying always that it's an internal matter, no matter what the issue is, because they're protecting themselves? Are people unwilling to name names? Are there fallacious arguments being used in court in order to stop something? Why is that? Well, they're doing it because it's protective of revenue or productive of a tradition. Protective of revenue or protective of a tradition. And then you have to ask, well, how old is this tradition? Oh, it's only been in the books since it's the 80s or something. Is this law now being used in a new way? This goes back to that speech, about taking the easy way. we use the civil asset forfeiture, for example, to solve a problem we were experiencing before, and yet that activity, the law we made to solve the old problem, ends up creating a new problem by itself, by the nature of laws and rules and monies and taxes and things. You solve an old problem, and the solution creates its own problem in return. Then you have to solve that problem, and that problem, and that problem. And you eventually become a better people and a better group. So this book, he is very much an admirer of the Swiss way. He also likes the Swiss banking laws. Don't give information about who owns the Swiss bank account. It's just a number. We won't tell you we won't tell you how much is in it. We won't tell you who owns it. We don't keep that sort of information. Or if you want to know who owns this Swiss bank account, you better have a finding of guilt of some sort. Or you can't just ask. And the idea here is money is tax. So the way it was explained to me is that what happened with Switzerland is you were raised in Switzerland in the Middle Ages. You don't really have anything to do, right? There's no great rivers. You live on top of a mountain. You can farm a little bit, but there isn't like great gold or iron mines. All you really have is people and rocks. Right? These rocks are walls around you, which make it easy to defend yourself. And you can raise enough food to keep yourself alive, but other than that, what do? If you want to improve your life, what do? You stay at home on the farm, or you go do something, right? So you end up creating a nation of soldiers, because it turns out you can make a whole lot of money by hiring yourself out as a soldier, as a mercenary. So you do that. You send the Swiss pikemen out as mercenaries. They make money, and then they send that money home. And now, all of a sudden, the resources you have at home are rock walls, some land to grow food, and a bunch of gold. Because the Swiss pikemen are sending their paychecks back home to put in mom and dad's hands. And mom and dad don't really need a lot, and they can't really buy a lot because this is the Middle Ages. Commerce has not hit its stride yet. You live a more comfortable life. Right? You're not building palaces out of solid gold. Because that was one option, right? We're going to spend all this money on extravagances. But maybe we could use the gold in a different way. Maybe we could start a bank. Maybe we could start lending gold. And we do have these rock walls, and we already have a lot of gold here. So maybe other people would be willing to keep their gold in our rock walls. Now you've got a banking system, and that was how it was explained to me at least, that Swiss mercenaries sent their pay back to Switzerland, and then the Swiss people back home used this money in order to do something, and it ended up turning into a banking system. It's a very it's politically stable in the middle of very politically unstable Europe around this time. It is easy to defend. It has a constant source of revenue. There isn't a whole lot of other things to do, right? Like, you aren't going to be engaged in a whole lot of trade because you have to go up and down the mountain in order to get anywhere. You don't have a seaport. You're landlocked. right? You don't raise a whole lot of your little valleys in the mountains. You don't raise a whole lot of food, right? And as far as I know, there isn't a great, like, there aren't like great mines in Switzerland. As far as I know, there's no tin mines of Cornwall or no mountain of iron in Bilbao or anything like that. So what do? You're not great traders, but you're politically safe. So people start storing their gold there, and you have gold that's used, and you have a banking system. And how do you protect yourselves? Well, you make it so that the government can't take that money from you. You make it so that taxes stay low. And it turns out that low taxes are very useful. So a lot of money and gold from all over Europe floods into Switzerland as it's a safe place. Because again, right, I'm sure that the Swiss banks held a ton of Jewish gold, for example, because gold's got to go somewhere. And the Jews are everywhere, and they act as bankers in every situation, and they don't want to keep the gold on them. They want to have it somewhere they can be used and is accessible. So send it to Switzerland. After all, you don't have many other options. Okay, so he says the Swiss believe that British and Americans are short-sighted. That's true. Failing to see that broad surveillance and snooping by government destroy individual liberty. All totalitarian states, communist and fascist, are characterized by intensive and unrelenting spying and snooping into the lives of their citizens. In a free society, the power of the government to spy on its citizens is strictly limited, restrained, and controlled. All their differences between a free society and despotism or totalitarianism are secondary. The way I've seen this is that my Swiss grandmother was occasionally very, very secretive about her wealth, as it is. Very, very secretive about other things too. Like she didn't gossip a lot, and she was very close-mouthed. And I don't know how do I explain Grandma? She was content, right? She wasn't the type of person to say, I need a whole lot of money and I'm desperate for and greedy. Very, very much the opposite of that. But at the same time, not willing to live in poverty. Not like I must sacrifice, become one with nature. No. I want a nice, comfortable, safe life. And she was very, very fair, as the case may be. Okay, then he begins to talk about Spain. Right? No nation in history better illuminates the thesis of this book than Imperial Spain. This great empire, which has never been equaled, was devastated by rebellious taxpayers from all ranks and in all possible ways. Voluntary taxpayer compliance, to use a modern term, was virtually unknown. Spanish taxpayers resorted to violence. They took to flight in every possible direction, and, finally, they developed a system of tax fraud and evasion that, in some circumstances, may have taken 90% of tax revenues from the government. Okay, so basically, as I understand it, this is what happened. Spain conquers vast areas of the New World. It turns out there's quite a bit of gold and a ton of silver that they can find in the New World. So they start mining it and finding it and pillaging it and sending it back to Spain. Now Spain has a bunch of money, a bunch of gold and silver. There is a great supply of gold and silver now in Europe, which causes the value of gold and silver, to tank like a rock. This is fine for a while because Spain has so much silver. But eventually, it becomes very difficult to keep the Spanish Empire going. on this revenue source. Because the more silver you bring in, the lower the supply, the more silver you bring in, the higher the supply, the lower the price goes. So you're getting reduced returns on this silver. Eventually, of course, you start having things like sugar plantations. You start, shipping slaves over, for example, and you find other revenue sources. But again, this only works for so long, and you begin to have slave rebellions, and you have to raise soldiers. And then meanwhile, you're spending a bunch of money back at home in Spain, improving the courts of Ferdinand and Isabella, and giving tax breaks to the citizens of Spain, while raising taxes on the colonies and so on. And so Spain eventually begins to start having revenue problems. And Spain is used to having a whole bunch of money. The Spanish government, the Spanish Empire, is very used to having tons of silver at its disposal. And they don't want to give up their fancy new lifestyle. They don't want to give up their empire. They want to keep very close control of it. But revenues are going down. So what do? You start to squeeze. And it turns out when you squeeze, people begin to evade you. And it turns out as well that when you're trying to squeeze people who are half a planet away from you using 17th and 16th and 18th century technology, you don't have much of effectiveness doing this. Right? It is very difficult for the Spanish government in Spain to know exactly how much silver is being pulled out of a mine in Argentina. And then that silver is put on a ship, and that ship heads to Imperial Spain. But maybe on the way it stops off at Cuba and gets some sugar, or maybe on the way it stops off at a little town off the coast in the middle of nowhere, let's say, or it picks up cargo that is consigned for Amsterdam and goes there first, and some of the silver just happens to fall off the ship. And by the time you end up returning to Spain with your consignment of silver, you have the correct papers that say, I left Argentina with 5 tons of silver. And you have 5 tons of silver in your hold, and so it's all fine. And then eventually, the Spanish government learns that you left Argentina with 35 tons of silver. And they repeat this ad nauseum. Repeat this at massive extreme levels. So what do? If you're the Spanish government, you squeeze more, and you squeeze more, and you squeeze more, and you squeeze so much, you get nothing. You pop the grape. The fruit which was falling to you by the grace of God, the silver and the gold, just disappears. And the more you try to reach for it, the farther away the fruit grows. You are eternally hungry. So what do? You raise taxes on Spain. You raise taxes on home. And now home, who has been used to very low taxes for a very long time, is very angry at you. And you had this struggle between, the colonies, us, and then the colonies, meanwhile, and at home, you're raising taxes, and people begin to evade them, so you squeeze harder, and now your legal sources of revenue start to suffer under very high taxation. And you have illegal organizations, smuggling rings, slave movements, rebellious merchantmen or nobles, for example. Che Guevara causing trouble And the harder you try to hold on, the more difficult it is. And so to this author, the correct answer for what the Spanish government should have done is not gripped so hard. The Spanish government should have let its hand fall away. Accept the 2% or whatever tax on silver you're getting from the mines as a bounty unlooked for, and accept it gladly. And it turns out that a 2% or a 0.5% tax on silver is so much trouble to evade that the silver mines and the ships carrying silver just don't even bother. Yeah, sure, the Spanish take 2% of the silver, but if I want to avoid the taxes, then I gotta sneak around under the cover of night. I gotta end up in Amsterdam at some point. I gotta have agreements to pick up other merchandise here and there. I have to tell the Spanish government the trip's going to take 6 months, but really it only takes me 5 months because I have a special fast ship. And I use this extra time to wander around to places in Africa I really shouldn't be going, and making interesting trade agreements. But my ship has to sit off the coast of Spain sometimes for like 4 days, so it doesn't arrive too late or too early. And and this is all costing you money and time and attention. Just pay the 2% tax. Ships from Argentina to Spain, very easy. And that's his claim here, that you have problems because you're reaching too far. And he also points out other issues as well. He says, in the type of taxes and in political orders, the most hated of all Spanish taxes and the most productive of revenue was the alcabala, a 10% excise on the transfer of all real and personal property. The transfer of all real and personal property? You mean when I sell you something, I have to say, when I sell you my house, I have to give part of the value of that to the Spanish government, which is destructive of commerce, which makes it a very bad tax, especially at 10%. But, he says, like our modern income tax, the alcabala produced so much revenue it could not be abolished. Indeed, it expanded to include food, and the rates increased. It became the most lucrative of all taxes. Hence the tenacity with which many generations of Castilian kings clung to this disastrous impost. The alcabala had a depressing effect on industry and trade. The same goods, as they changed hands, paid this tax many times over, and priced Castilian goods out of the market at home and abroad. Revenue measures required the approval of the Cortes, a body of taxpayer representatives like the English Parliament or French Estates General. Nobles and churchmen were tax immune, so their vote was unimportant. Deputies from the town and commoners were all important. Their consent was required for the taxation of their constituents. This procedure had all the appearances of a good parliamentary government, but in practice, the Cortes did as the king asked. I don't know what the accent I'm using, what that is. On one rare occasion, when the Cortes turned down the finance minister's request, the king marched into the Cortes and ordered the ministers to approve his request in 30 minutes. The deputies remained steadfast, and the rebuffed king left in a rage. By evening, martial law was imposed on the province. The deputies quickly assembled and approved the king's demands. Very strong king. Very grasping king, very king who doesn't want to give up his ancient privileges and rule, very much a king who does not want to spend less money. Why? Because he controls the power to tax, and he can raise taxes and get money to do with however he likes. And who are these uppity commoners to tell him that he shouldn't spend his money because he is Spain, he is the kingdom. It all belongs to him anyway. And besides, he has the power. He has the army. Now, Charles established a council of finance and ordered the council to apply the screws to uncooperative taxpayers. And then is another problem here, he points out, which is the exact problem of Rome, again. Second, a great number of taxpayers with some education joined the tax-immune civil service. As the government's army of civil servants expanded, the labor force plummeted. Unnecessary civil servants are leeches in the tax system, and Spain, like Rome, had more leeches than taxpayers. Third, taxpayers with money and influence became nobles or hidalgos. Fourth, poor overtaxed peasants with no education, money, or influence often joined the nearest band of gypsies after the tax system had reduced them to abject poverty. The more you grass, the more runs through your hands like sand, like water. The more greedy for money you are, and when you control the government, when you are the king, when you control the tax, then how do you get money? You get it through tax, or you get it through wars. And it's very difficult sometimes to engage in war. Much, much easier to tax your own citizens. Much, much easier to tax your colonies. Right? It says the alcabala was instituted to relieve the crown of the financial burden of maintaining Spanish troops. Money had to be shipped from Spain to finance Spanish forces. This money was often seized by pirates. And then Spain is at one point controlling the Netherlands, and it turns out that the Netherlands are like the Jews of Europe, if that makes sense, right? It's a place with lots of harbors. It's a place with not a lot of stuff they grow themselves. It's a place which is really good for trade. Very good for trade. And traders tend to become rich. So there's lots of wealth in the Netherlands. So you start to go, as the king, I think I should raise taxes on the Netherlands. After all, I am protecting them as the emperor, as the king. After all, they belong to me. And the Netherlands are going, why are our taxes going up and up and up, and nothing's changing? Like, we aren't under threat of being invaded by another country. You know, the Spanish king is spending his monies on the Spanish court and on Cordoba and whatnot. He's or on more troops for the colonies. The Spanish king isn't spending his money improving the Netherlands. So you have rebellion. And now Spain, because it asked for too many taxes from the Netherlands, has to deal with this. And it's just more and more and more. Right? If you control the power to tax and the power to spend, then you tax to the limit and you spend to the limit of rebellion, of trouble, which means you have a tendency to always have your country be on the edge. You're taxing them. You're taxing the peasants and the nobles and the Jews and the tradespeople and whatnot just enough so that they don't rebel against you. You are maximizing profits. You're being a good businessman. But of course, like all good businesses, eventually an idiot gets put in charge. Eventually, you continue the same practices, but the economic situation of the planet has changed. Technology has moved on, for example. Or there is a movement of smugglers. Or the tax you started in order to solve a problem becomes itself its own problem. Right? We're running out of money. We're going to have for the troops. Well, we'll institute a tax, the alcabala. Right? Oh, it turns out that this tax depresses revenue. And now I have less money coming in. It turns out people don't like this tax. So now I have to deal with rebellions about it. And it turns out that this is a cycle that continues and continues and continues. Why? Because the power to tax and the power to spend are in the same hands. if the king could collect taxes but not spend them, then the king has no incentive to raise taxes. If the king could spend taxes but not raise them, then the king literally has to work with what money the people give him. And this is the point the author is trying to make about how a government he believes should be run, about how taxes should be allowed in a government entity. A government entity should not be able to both tax and spend. You have to separate these things. You have to, the treasury raises taxes, but the agriculture department spends these taxes that the treasury gives them. But the treasury shouldn't be able to raise taxes. Like, the treasury should not have an political influence, or the treasury should not. This is interesting, right? Because it's technically speaking, how do you separate the power to tax and spend, right? Because if I am an organization, if I'm the government, right, and I'm part A of the organization, and I'm tax part of the tax part of the organization, part A, and part B is the spending part, then you must communicate back and forth, right? Because the spending part is going to say, okay, how much am I going to have to spend next year? Or I have to have plans going out 5, 10, 15 years for spending like F-35s or something. So I need some information here. And the tax collecting part of the government is going to say, okay, this is the information I have. This is, I think, what taxes are going to be. Okay. So you have collection of taxes and sale of taxes. So what we're actually looking for is ability to apply taxes or raise taxes. Okay, so it's not the treasury at all. It's going to be the legislative branch. It's going to be the lawmakers who have the ability to raise taxes. Change how much taxes are. But you don't want the executive. So in the American system, right, you have the president spends money, but Congress decides what the taxes are. The problem, of course, is that the federal government can raise money through things like fines, for example, which is a bad idea. Because then you have an incentive to keep those fines, to keep raising those fines and apply those fines as often as possible, because it's the only sure source of revenue you have, only source within your control. Congress, and then the legislative branch, meanwhile, if you collect taxes, so he's saying that you would want to have a legislative branch which does not tell the executive how to spend money. So that would be interesting. That would be like, if in America at least, Congress raised taxes and collected money for taxes, and then said, we're just going to give this to the president. He can do whatever he wants with it. We're not going to have an oversight. We don't know what he's doing. Well, that's a bad idea, right? You want to know what the president is doing. You want to have an oversight. You want to have an understanding of how money is being spent. So you come to a bit of a conundrum, right? Because the federal government, so if you're the president, then can you say to Congress, I will spend money that you haven't given me. I will put the nation into debt. Or can you say to Congress, you've given me money and I will not spend it. You've told me to spend the money and I will not spend this money. And that is an example of the separation of the power to tax and spend. So you would give that money back. So this author, I think, would be in favor of like of a tax remittance. by the executive branch. But we know that this in itself is dangerous. Because a tax remittance by the executive branch actually, in practice, mixes the ability to tax and spend. In that you can lower taxes, but not raise them. So that's an interesting point. Because the power over taxes is both to raise and lower it. And this, I think, deserves more study. Like these are questions I think I would be interested in asking to know more about the mechanics of taxation here. But for now, let's continue through, let's see, the last section in this part of the book, how Cortez found the taxes that were the chinks in Montezuma's armor. Okay, he says, the story behind the conquest of Mexico is one of the most fascinating tales in history. Until recently, historians offered the Quetzalcoatl story to explain Cortez's incredible feat. When Hernan Cortez landed in Veracruz in 1519, the Aztecs are supposed to have thought he was the bearded god returning. Before they knew otherwise, Cortez had seized control of the empire and killed Montezuma II. This is actually the story I was told in school. Like, straight up, it was Cortez arrived, the Aztecs thought he was a god, and he took over from there. Not a whole lot of detail, but the idea is there that Spanish arrive, the Aztecs are idiots, and it collapsed, and the entire empire collapses like a house of cards. The actual story, of course, is very different. My understanding today is especially that the disease, smallpox and whatnot, that the Europeans brought would have had a huge effect upon the way they managed to conquer all of Mexico, all of the Americas. But the author here is going to focus on the taxes. Why? Because Tlaxcalans. Okay, the Tlaxcalans, I'm not sure how to say this. Tlaxcalans. This group, who were the most defiant and successful of all the Aztec tax rebels. Fortunately for Cortez, they lived midway between Veracruz and Mexico City. For without the Tlaxcalans, it is difficult to see how Cortez could have succeeded. There were other rebellious cities on the edge of the empire. Cortez landed in Veracruz, and near Veracruz, an Aztec tax-paying territory. One day, when Cortez was walking along the beach near Veracruz, he met 5 Indians who were embittered by the yoke of Aztec taxation. It was a momentous discovery for Cortez. He had found his answer. Taxes were the chink in Montezuma's armor. Following this lead, Cortez went to visit the city of these discontented taxpayers. So you have the Aztec Empire, they're collecting tax from cities, and Cortez happens to run into the citizens of one of these cities who are very disappointed with the Aztec taxes. So now he has some very useful allies, because these folk he runs into are like, hey, you don't like the Aztecs? We don't like the Aztecs. Let's be friends. Let's take down the Aztecs together. It'll be great. I mean, then Cortez turns around and stabs them in the back and enslaves their entire civilization and burns their knowledge to the ground and in ash and dust, ash and blood, and everything they are is forgotten. Their cities abandoned to the jungle. But ay ay ay. And if the Aztec Empire had been an empire, the claim at least is that if the Aztec Empire had been such that it did not have these discontented cities on the edge, then Cortez would not have conquered it. They would instead of taking advantage of internal discordance in the Aztec Empire, he would have run into an Aztec Empire which was unified. And why would it have been unified? Well, if it to have a country be unified, they need to agree to the taxes they are paying. Right? Taxes do not need to be too burdensome. The central government needs to have a clear idea of what's going on, so it has to know information about the area so it can collect taxes. So you do not want a system where you collect taxes from the guy in charge of this city, and he gives you all the taxes. No, you want intimate information and knowledge of all the citizens of the entire state of the country. And you don't want high taxes, because that invites rebellion and that invites evasion and smuggling. You want a tax system where instead of taxmen that are feared, you have taxmen that are liked. You want, instead of you show up one day with your army and say, I demand money, or I burn your city to the ground, you want to have a continuous presence in that city, so that the Prince of Moscow, the Duchy or the Prince of Moscow, doesn't build a fortress and raise an army without you even noticing. No, you have to be involved in what's going on. And so you sort of have two choices, is what he begins to get at here. You either have a sort of Swiss confederacy, a very loose, weak federal government with smaller political groupings who are united as one, and these will tend to have rather low taxes. Why do they have low taxes? Because high taxes means a very strong central government. Low taxes, very weak central government. And because a government is protective of its own revenue, and power corrupts, once you have a strong central government, the central government tends to stay very strong. The central government doesn't disperse itself into a confederation. Or you have a tax system where the central government is very strong and very well informed about what its citizens are doing, very well informed about all the taxes it is involved in, and as well as when have taxes which ideally are not indirect. You do not want a ton of indirect taxes, because indirect taxes depress commerce, which means that your country is weaker than it should be. It's weaker than it could be. You may collect money by charging people who use your road, but this means that only people who already have money will be using your road. This means that people who are poor won't rise up and use your road for free and become rich themselves and then pay direct taxes. You want a political system and a tax system where you don't have groups of people who are immune to taxation, because then these groups of people will begin to expand. Those who have money will join the group of people who are tax immune. They'll join the church. They will join the nobility. And those groups of people who are tax immune have an easier time getting involved in commerce because they don't have to pay taxes. So they expand, and your tax base shrinks, because when they expand, they push out all the others who are paying taxes who can't compete with them. So you see a sort of cascade of events happening in everything from Russia, Switzerland, Spain, Germany having to do with the Jews in Europe and the Romans and the English and the Aztecs and the Spaniards and the Islamic empires, right? You see the same sort of flow happening. Some person, some group, some king, some central government needs money for something, and so it puts a tax on the people. And then it needs more money. So it puts another tax and another tax. And eventually starts squeezing the stone for taxes. And you either crush the stone, you crush the country, and it falls apart. You incite rebellions because you're acting like a businessman trying to grab as much money as possible. And what's the answer? For him, at least, it is low taxes. Have low taxes and in a government which does not do much. He'll get into this soon enough. He talks about Germany a little bit too. And he points out something which is interesting but troublesome as well, right? He says, one of the most delightful stories in the entire history of taxation came from Frederick's troubled times. This is Frederick the Great, was a ruler of Prussia. During one of his cabinet meetings, Frederick asked his finance minister why his treasury was so low when his subjects were paying so much tax. Where was all the money going? To explain the problem, the finance minister asked for a piece of ice. He handed it to the minister farthest from the king and told him to pass it to the next person on up to the king. By the time the ice reached Frederick, all he received was a wet hand. The lesson the finance minister taught the king: most taxes are consumed by the bureaucracies of the government. It is a wonder Frederick even received a wet hand. So, this is probably the most important lesson about these ancient empires, because we're going to start to see a change. These ancient empires collect taxes by taxmen, or by going to a great noble, by going to a city and saying, give me money, and they delegate their power to tax. This means that every hand that is needed to collect the tax takes a bit, because they have to survive. This is, like, if you are a farmer and you sell corn, well, every extra step in the chain, somebody has to make money. You sell corn to a wholesaler. That person who runs a wholesale business needs to make money. That wholesaler sells corn to a factory. Well, that factory needs to make money. That factory takes that corn and sells it to you. Now, theoretically, I, the consumer, could have bought this corn from the farmer for a certain amount of money, but I'm paying 4 times that to the factory. It's the same with tax, right? The Great Mongol Horde collects taxes, and first they send their own taxmen. Turns out that's troublesome. That's difficult, being involved in the direct collection of taxes. So they farm it out to some random Russian nobleman nobody's ever heard of. And he gives them their money, and he takes his cut. And he takes a bigger cut than he tells the Mongols about. And the Mongols have no idea this is happening because they didn't keep a good enough eye. And they had levels of the bureaucracy which were not answerable to them, and so on. So what's going to begin to happen is that governments need more information. You start seeing troubles in Europe, especially around taxation and mighty empires, mighty kings squeezing the people too hard and causing problems, causing economic malaise, and the issues of the Roman Republic happen. It's not outside forces that cause these problems, it is interior flaws. Yeah, it's interesting reading about the history because you see the same story play out, but each place it plays out is a little differently. It's not quite exactly the same story and processes, right? I was earlier comparing Russia and Rome, and they had the exact same problem at one point, but they reacted to it differently, and that had a different effect. They were in different economic or geographic or political situations, and different leaders, and this had an effect. So it is definitely possible to read these stories and look at our own country today and see parallels. But this doesn't mean that the parallels are exact. It means that we need to try to learn it. And this is the great trouble of learning from history, right? History isn't exact. I worried last time about the United States of America falling just like Rome did, but it won't fall in exactly the same way. There won't be a Caesar crossing the Rubicon. Instead, it will be more like an Augustus, for example. I mention, these countries who are taxing people and squeezing them. And here we don't have massive tax immune nobles. We just have regressive taxation in certain ways. We have governments which control the ability to tax and to spend, but they're also getting into debt, right? Like they're spending more than they're taxing. And so we are able to avoid some of those problems, whereby we have to squeeze the taxes more and more and more just to maintain our current lifestyle, because we can borrow more and more and more money just to maintain our current lifestyle, our current country style. But this isn't the days of the Jewish bankers who you could threaten at the tip of a sword or a spear. This isn't the days where you could say, "Give me all your stuff or I'll kill you." This isn't the days where it was hard to hide money. No, this is the days of a large banking system, of countries out there and systems being available and exchanging of goods in complex ways, and an integrated economy where every action by any government about taxes or production or consumption affects every other government in some way. This is a place where we have a stock market, a public information which is very influential in our activities. This is the days where the average person in the street has access to information about his or her economic situation, or the country's economic situation. These are the days where we aren't peasants sitting on farms or serfs unable to understand what's going on. We may be wage slaves in many ways, but we have also achieved the 40-hour work week for many of us. We have phones where we can communicate with anyone around us. We don't have to sneak and hide our speeches. If we disagree with a tax or with a spending choice, then we have the ability to say so, to lobby, to not be thrown in prison because we disagree with the king. And, we ought to, I think, utilize these abilities in order to see how we can overcome these ancient problems in new ways. For example, not all of these new ways will work, but I was speaking yesterday about, managed capitalism, and that is the idea, I think, that I'm getting at here, or trending towards. We need to learn from history, and upon seeing that history in our own day, not repeat the same mistakes, not move in exactly the same way, but instead use our eyes to comprehend and use our new capabilities to change our fate. And I was speaking with a relative of mine today about how we've been hearing the same issues. Rising debt, government debt. It's harder to find a job. It is a era of oligarchy or threatening oligarchy and whatnot. And we've been hearing the same story for literally my entire lifetime. And it's like we when I read stuff like this, when I read these histories of taxes and whatnot, in Rome especially, just because it's so important in my education, is that we seem to be walking into the future screaming and crying and shouting. There are alarm bells going off every day about the problems we have, and yet we continually ignore them. It's the same in these Islamic empires and the Roman empires and the Russian empires. There were people writing and speaking and letting it be known that there are troubles in the kingdom, there are troubles in the republic, and yet they were ignored because the people in power liked the lifestyle they had and weren't willing to change it in order to retain it.